The dinosaurs. Where do they fit into the Bible story? Well, hopefully we're going to find that out. So if we take a traditional viewpoint and go to Google and look at Wikipedia, this is what Wikipedia has to say about dinosaurs. They first appeared during the Triassic period between 243 and 233.23 million years ago. Although the exact origin and timing of the evolution of dinosaurs is the subject of active research. The reason is they don't know, and when I last gave this talk, which was pre-lockdown, they've added on another 12 years to the time of the dinosaurs. They pushed it further back. And they became the dominant terrestrial vertebrates after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event of 201.3 million years ago, and then they were wiped out in the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event approximately 66 million years ago. In other words, they lived a long, long time ago, long before man, and have been wiped out, but we find them through the fossils. So that's a long time ago, isn't it? 243 million years ago. It's a bit hard to get our heads around that, because I believe that's rubbish, what they're saying there. That I believe that the dinosaurs were created by God about 6,000 years ago. And 6,000 years, if on the screen, I don't know, I estimate that's about 2 meters long. So if a 2 meter line represents 6,000 years, how long a line how many times longer than that will we have to draw a line to represent 243 million years ago? Would it be 20,500 times more, or 30.5, 40.5, 50.5? Well, this is where you've got to put your hand up. Is answer A correct? Is answer B correct? Is answer C correct? -2. Is answer D correct? Well, not many of you are participating. You must have had too much dinner and nearly asleep. Well, the answer is C. And that line would have to be 81 kilometres, 50 miles long to represent that time scale on the same thing. So here we are in rugby, and I've drawn a circle. That should have come up automatically, it didn't. 81 kilometres, 50 miles, so we'll be north of Nottingham, or that line will be just beyond Luton, or way beyond Birmingham. So totally different time scale. And what I want to show is that the evolutionists have great problems with their time scales, because things don't fit. Whereas with the Bible time frame, everything fits, it makes sense. And 6,000 years, to me, is a long time ago. It's 76 times longer than I've lived. That's a long time ago. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, including the dinosaurs. See, some of the problems with millions and billions of years is that we find remains of dinosaurs, not fossilised, but fresh bones. And furthermore, some of the bones are smelly. So if something was wiped out 66 million years ago, how can we still have fresh bones? How can we still have bones which smell of death? And more recently, they have found that inside some of these bones are soft tissues, are remains of blood, which everybody knows, a few weeks and a blood sample dries up. It just doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if these creatures were fossilised, or died out, or some of them died out more recently. And we have to explain why there are so many man-made depictions of creatures looking like dinosaurs, which have been carved on churches, have been decorated in various places, or drawn on rocks. Now, how did people, if these died out long before man came on the scene, how is it possible that they could have given depictions of what we today say, oh, well, that's a certain type of dinosaur, Stegosaurus or whatever? It only makes sense if the dinosaurs were part of God's creation and existed at the same time as man. And we also have many living creatures which show up in the fossils but are still alive today, totally unchanged. So, where did evolution go wrong there? And not only just animals, but plants. We'll see an example of that. I've got a plant growing in my garden, which you can see fossilised remains of its very distinctive leaves, but totally the same. So we're going to fit dinosaurs into a biblical framework. We're going to see worldwide depictions of them. We're going to see examples of living fossils. We're going to perhaps look at some living dinosaurs. And look at this matter of the fresh blood and tissue that they now found. And ask the question, well, if God created them at the beginning with mankind, they're contemporary with man, why, if we go to a Bible dictionary, we don't find the word dinosaur? Well, there's a very simple answer to that, and I think we'll find that, we have not the word dinosaur, but we have descriptions, and we've read one of them in that passage from Job, which is one of the oldest books of the Bible. Job lived before the time of Abraham, probably, and very clearly a depiction of animals that don't exist today, but existed in Job's day. And we'll see how they're part of God's creation, contemporary with man, and their demise was largely brought about by the flood, which the Bible tells us. And again, if we believe what the Bible says, that God created 6,000 years ago, and then there was a catastrophic flood 1,600 years later in the time of Noah, this explains where all the fossils came from. And so we'll have a little look at that. But remains of dinosaurs are found throughout the whole world. So every country really has dinosaur remains. What hits the headlines are the big dinosaurs, but not all dinosaurs were huge. Some were only chicken size. But it's the big ones that excite the children, excite the adults as well. When the creatures 13 metres high, 17 metres high, 18 metres high, you can see the scale of the man at the bottom, would tower way outside this. Would be like the chimney on Rugby Cement Works. And more recently, the granddaddy of them all, Titanosaurus, about 20 metres, 60 feet high. Absolutely huge, towering above man. But what we have to remember, because the people say, well, you're going to tell me that Noah took the dinosaurs on the ark? I say, yes, of course he did. God brought all the animals to him that went on the ark. Well, how could he get a dinosaur on the ark? Well, what we have to remember is that cold-blooded animals carry on growing until they die. And the Bible makes it clear that mankind was living 900 years. Methuselah nearly lived 1,000 years. So if in the pre-flood world men were living long ages, it seems quite reasonable that the other animals would live long ages, would live hundreds of years. So if you're a cold-blooded creature like a dinosaur, you just carry on growing and growing and growing and growing. Now, I meant, Barnaby, when I saw the rugger ball, I thought, well, bring the rugger ball in. But you know the size of a rugger ball. Well, the eggs of this Tyrannosaurus are about the size of a rugger ball, about a foot long, 30 centimetres long. So when it was born, it was that small that it would fit inside a rugger ball, and would take probably hundreds of years. These are granddaddies have been going for centuries to get to this huge size. Now, why did God put animals on the ark? Well, it was to repopulate the earth after everything had been wiped out in the flood. And so God would bring to Noah animals which were young, got a long breeding season ahead of them. And so even the biggest of these dinosaurs would, if they were young, would be the size of a sheep or a horse or something like that. No problem getting them on the ark. And it's interesting, when we look at the fossils, we find that the fossils show us that, what the Bible says makes sense of man living longer times, other creatures living longer times. They would get to big sizes. These are some oysters, and you see from the size of the pick that they're much bigger than the oysters that you would get on the market. But note one thing. Those oysters are closed. When a shellfish dies, very soon its muscles relax, it opens. Fossils are of creatures that were alive when they were fossilised. They were suddenly overwhelmed. And so many indicate a huge size, like the oysters. So, yeah, they carried on growing and growing and growing. When they were overwhelmed by the flood, some of them were of a huge size. That's a lady sitting by an ammonite fossil. Huge. But you see, what the Bible tells us, man living a long time, and we interpolate that the animals likewise lived a long time, it makes sense. Here's a toad, huge compared with today's toads, but remains of huge toads have been found because they carried on growing. And only this week in the New Scientist, there was an article about the biggest animal. They thought that the blue whale was the biggest creature ever existed, but now they've found remains of this Ichthyosaurus that is so huge that it even dwarfs a blue whale. That was what the article was about. And as I said, the shellfish and things like that, which would be open if they were dead when they were overcome. We also have a situation where a fish is eating another fish and it's suddenly encapsulated. Here's another ichthyosaur in the stage of giving birth when it gets fossilised. So it's an indication that, the flood is a wonderful explanation, because when creatures die, they get eaten, don't they? Nothing's wasted. If a goldfish or any kind of fish dies, then the other fish or other creatures which will come along and eat them don't turn into fossils. Fossils indicates a terrible catastrophe. You need pressure, heat to do it. And only the flood fits the situation. And all the fossils are in what we call waterborne rock. But we'll come to that a bit later on. It's thought that 95% of the dinosaurs were plant eaters. Say not all were huge. There were small dinosaurs, big dinosaurs. There were sea creatures, huge sea creatures, and small sea creatures. There were ordinary birds and there were huge birds. It indicates that creatures carrying on and growing for a long period of time. Generally, what we find is not a beautiful skeleton of an animal, but bones, just scattered and, as I say, embedded in sediment. We don't find intermediate forms. There's no evidence from the fossil record of any transition from a lower creature to a higher creature, in spite of all the stories that they make about the progression of man. As time goes on, those stories get revised, and there is no pattern of any evolutionary process of animals changing one from another, but that's not our subject tonight. Yes, they're found in sedimentary. Sedimentary rock is waterborne. Nearly always they're all facing in the same direction, indicating they're caught up in a thrust of water that overwhelms them. And eventually, under all the pressure of the water and the heat from the volcanic action that the Bible tells us in the time of the flood, they have this catastrophe of being turned into fossils, but it gives us an indication of what existed. And the other thing we have to be cognizant of is from a skeleton. Even, if you've got a pretty good skeleton like that, you've really no idea what the finished creature looks like. It is purely artistic representation. Give the same fossils to different illustrators. If they're biased towards evolution, then you'll get a very evolutionary-looking creature. If they're not, then you can't tell. See, there's a skeleton, and you think, well, perhaps that's a young lion. You could draw it like that, reproduce it like that. In actual fact, that's the skeleton of a poodle, which is totally different. But you can't tell from the skeleton. And that looks very much like a turkey, doesn't it? But in actual fact, it's the skeleton of a peacock. You see, all the feathers and that just disappeared. You're just left with the foundations, bones, as it were. And so any pictures you see here, any pictures you see in a book, is artistic interpretation. Because most of the fossils are just a mass of bones, all heaped together, which again points to the flood as being explanation. It can't just all have died on that spot and somehow turned into fossils. Fossils speak of catastrophe. The Bible tells us of catastrophe. All makes sense. And there are many historical accounts of these large creatures which we'll look at, and ancient pictures of strange creatures. Babylonians had wonderful depictions which have, lasted for millennia. Depictions of ordinary animals that you would go and recognise, but among them are other creatures which you wouldn't recognise. Look at the front legs and look at the back legs. You ever seen a creature like that? And a long neck like that? But he must have, if all the others are of creatures that he drew, why create pictures of things that didn't exist? It makes much more sense that creatures like that did exist in the time of the Babylonians, and there they are depicted. And very much, we've got stories of dragons throughout the world. Again, we shall look at some quotations of explorers from different ages about the dragons that they found. And they must have some origin. And that creature from Babylon looks very much like a dragon. Have the account of George slaying the dragon. But not 100 miles from here is a church at Bredon-on-the-Hill. It's just outside Leicester. And again, on the carvings in the church, you see animals which you clearly recognise, no problems at all. But then among them are these. I'll just blow it up so we can see in more detail. But clearly bipedal creatures, kind of things that we get depictions of in the time of the Babylonians. They have seals with creatures looking like this. And one has to say, well, did the carver have a lot of cheese the night before and had these horrible dreams and decided to carve these fantastic creatures? Or was it something that existed in his day and he incorporated them in what he was doing? This is a tomb up in Carlisle Cathedral with a famous Bishop, Richard Bell. And all around the top stone is a brass strip which has got writing on. There's the actual picture. This is a reconstruction, as it were, so make it a bit clearer. But between the words are pictures of creatures, 4 different types of fish, a fox, a bear, a dog, birds, all recognisable. But there are some creatures which look just like dinosaurs. In that top picture, if you just look at the end there, on the tail of that creature, it seems to have some little spikes, very much like a stegosaurus. And, you can see the long necks of these creatures, and the one down below, on a different part of the thing. There is a depiction of a very much dinosaur-looking creature. Go to Utah and you can see a depiction of a man drawn in the rocks, but also a depiction of what we would say, well, that's a sauropod dinosaur. Again, it's interesting that from the fossils we can say, we can identify that. So was it just made up out of somebody's imagination, or did he know that kind of creature and drew it? So I call this living fossils. This coelacanth is a very famous example because it was thought that this was totally extinct, only known from fossil remains, and it's got these strong limbs at the bottom, and this was supposed to show evolution, that here was the beginning of arms as this creature crawled out from the sea onto land. And then in the 1930s, somebody went, it was in South Africa, on the fish market, saw them selling fish, which he knew was a coelacanth. Wasn't extinct after all. And now they've found that, yes, it's a fish that's still alive. And no, they aren't legs to help it crawl, but it's a ground feeder, and it just uses those to be kind of paddles as it propels itself along. And as I say, that was supposed, the evolutionists before this discovery said, they all died out 65 million years ago. And now find that's rubbish that they exist today, swimming in the sea. And the Komodo dragons, which are just found on a certain part in the Pacific, they were discovered in 1912, just over 100 years ago. And these creatures are described as living examples of the prehistoric age of the reptiles. But they exist. They grow to about 30 feet. But if they lived, they live about 60 years or so. Very vicious creatures, keep well away from them. But if they could live for 120 to 100 years, because they're cold-blooded, they will be huge creatures. This is a kapaki, and that was in the good old days when I was younger. That was part of the alleged evolution of the horse, showing how horses had evolved. In fact, that didn't make sense at all because they went from... it never fitted, but they were desperate to find a link. And now they found that the alpaca isn't extinct at all. It's still alive, still living. Hasn't been wiped out. And I said about the trees, the ginkgo biloba tree, it's got a very distinctive leaf to it. And we find those leaves preserved in the fossil remains. Still alive? Well, I hope ours has survived the winter, I'm sure it will. And we find also more recent discoveries. This is Blashford Snell. By recent, this goes back 30 years. He was exploring it in Nepal and came across Nepalese elephants. First time that white man had ever seen them 30 years ago. And what was so interesting was the distinctiveness of these Nepalese elephants. They had this hump, as it were, above their head. Now, if we go to France, and in the cave paintings, which are allegedly 30,000 years old, we have depictions of those elephants, exactly as the Nepalese ones are, with their hump. So it makes sense, yes, the people of the time, this was a creature that they understood. What our dispute is of 30,000 years, because that is only man's interpretation of how he tries to work out whether they're by man, and man had just come on the scene. But we don't have to bother with that because the Bible stands on its own. So here are ancient paintings of creatures which are still alive. And we talked about bones, fresh bones, smelly bones. So in 1961, a petroleum geologist discovered a large half-metre thick bone bed. As the bones were fresh, not pre-mineralised, he assumed that these were recent bison bones. It took 30 years for the scientists to recognise that they were in fact duck-billed dinosaur bones in this deposit, as well as horned dinosaurs and large and small carnivorous dinosaurs. So these are fresh bones. As this poses, how could these bones have remained in fresh condition for 70 million years is a perplexing question. They can't find an answer to it. It's because they got the time scale completely wrong. That's the normal geological column that they use to interpret, well, if we find this particular fossil, we read across the chart, that must be that age. And it's entirely man-made, the ages allocated to these things. I believe it's that fossil record is much more a record of the order in which animals died, creatures died in the flood. The simpler ones would be overwhelmed first, and those that could escape and climb would be the last to get overwhelmed. And so I believe that what we see in the geological column, the differences as one goes up, it is not anything to do with their evolution, it is to do with their devolution, their death in the time of the flood. And water grades out. Heavier things and lighter things separates them. Some fantastic videos on YouTube on the stratification, which fits the Bible picture beautifully. This now goes back 15 years or so. The finding when Mary Schweitzer discovered that the bones she was examining had fresh tissue in them, stretchy tissue, she could stretch it. She couldn't believe it because it didn't make sense, because she was an evolutionist. And she repeated the experiment and repeated it and repeated and repeated and repeated. After about 19, 20 times, she said, well, this is reality. And when she began to publish what she had found, there was a huge outcry. She lost her job there because what she was saying stuck a dagger through the heart of evolution, evolutionary timing. Everybody knows that blood can't last that kind of time. The findings amazed colleagues who had never imagined that even a trace of still soft dinosaur tissue could survive. After all, as any textbook will tell you, when an animal dies, soft tissues such as blood vessels, muscles and skin decay and disappear over time, while hard tissues like bone may gradually acquire minerals from the environment and become fossils. Schweitzer, one of the first scientists to use the tools of modern cell biology to study dinosaurs, has upended the conventional wisdom by showing that some rock-hard fossils, tens of millions of years old, may have remnants of soft tissues hidden away in their interiors. The Discovery article, written in 2006, speaking of all this, went on to document the unwillingness of many of the scientific community to believe the findings, even to the point Dr. Schweitzer was having a hard time trying to get a work published in scientific journals. I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said, he knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. So she said she can understand why so many are sceptical. If you took a blood sample and stuck it on a shelf, you'd have nothing recognisable in about a week. So why should there be anything left in dinosaurs? Well, it's only if you believe in evolutionary timescales. Why indeed, unless of course they haven't been extinct for millions of years, and their remains were preserved quickly by an unusual event. Schweitzer said of the moment she found dinosaur red cells in the 1990s, I just got goosebumps, because everybody knows these things don't last for 65 million years. And then she recounts this bit about the smelly bones, that she noticed that some of the bones she was examining had a very cardiferous, dead bodies smell. And she asked this paleontologist who worked in the area where these things were, that, yeah, if you go to Hell Creek where these bones are, yes, there is this smell of death there. Lasting 65 million years. Doesn't make sense. And then, subsequently, other people have come along and found blood. In this one was in the horns of a soft tissue of well, it's on the next slide. We'll get there. So this is allegedly an 80 million year old hadrosaur fossil. And so they confirmed that it's not contamination, because that was the excuse, it's just got contaminated. No, it wasn't. And so the chap, Mr. Mark Armitage, he lost his job too, because what he was saying went against the grain. And the other problem was there was a lot of carbon-14 in the remains, and carbon-14 doesn't have a very long life, and therefore there shouldn't be any trace of carbon-14 in something that's older than about 20,000, 30,000 years. The fact that there was abundant carbon in it too meant that there was something very basically wrong with the traditional idea of timescales. So, why don't we find dinosaurs in the Bible? Well, very simple reason, because it's a modern word. This chap, Richard Owen, in 1842, made up this word of two Greek words, dinos and sauros, terrible, fearful, great, lizards, reptiles, and put them together to describe these bones that they were finding, these huge creatures. So we won't find the word dinosaur in the Bible, because when the Bible was translated, it didn't exist. But do we find descriptions of the dinosaurs in the Bible? Well, God tells us in Genesis chapter 1, what we were reading this morning, that God created great sea creatures, or the authorised version, whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And that word, great, is something that is big, that's simple and straightforward. And the word translated sea creatures, or authorised version whales, is this tannin, and it's just described as a marine or land monster, something on a big scale. So the Bible tells us that God created these big monsters in the beginning, part of his creation. And the 28 references in the Old Testament to the tannin. Dragon, it appears as dragon 21 times in the authorised version, sea monster once, serpent 3 times, whale 3 times. So we read by way of introduction and turn to Job chapter 40. And notice what God says about this particular creature called Behemoth. And God specifically says, which I made along with you. So at the time when I created man, I created these creatures. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. This is the New King James, which just gives that little bit of crispness. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he that made him can bring near his sword. So this is a terrifying creature that Job knows about, he understands, and like his fellow companions, are very much afraid of. Surely the mountains yield food for him, all the beasts that play there. And, this is a wonderful description which we read of this creature which man couldn't disturb because it was so frightening and so big and so powerful that they couldn't catch it or do anything with it. So it's a creature that is described as behemoth, and apparently the Hebrew is a very interesting construction. It has a plurality of intensity. This is the beast of beasts, of the land animals, and this is the king that I have made, Job. So what do we learn of it? Well, it's the beast of beasts. It's contemporary with man. Job knew all about it, had great strength, had a tail like a cedar tree. And there's a cedar tree, if you don't know what a cedar tree looks like. And chief of the ways of God, and is absolutely fearless. Now, my margin says that this is perhaps an elephant. Others say hippopotamus. He moves his tail like a cedar. That little thing? Even that little thing? It doesn't make sense, does it? But how about Brachiosaurus? Now, this is a book that I had on dinosaurs when my children were young. There's a time when it was thought that these tails were an encumbrance to these animals and dragged behind them. Quite a few years ago now, it was realised that these didn't drag on the ground. These tails were a wonderful counterweight to the very long necks. And there was a wonderful design. And so there was a period, probably before a lot of you youngsters were born, when the museum shut for a few days and they hoisted up the tails from dragging on the ground and had them as a counterweight, like is shown in that picture there. So he moves his tail like a cedar. Well, that's the distinctiveness of a cedar tree, isn't it? Its branches go out like that. You can tell a cedar tree from a mile away. So a creature like this was contemporary with Job and fits the description that is there. And then the next chapter, if we'd read on, we read of a sea creature, Leviathan. And again, this is a creature that Job was acquainted with, knows about, but is a frightening creature that they can't capture because it is so powerful. You can't put a jaw in its hooks and its jaw, or even harpoon him or catch him with fishing spears. Lay your hand on him, remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? And it goes on, and just at the bottom there, it speaks of his wonderful scales, so tight. His sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils. As from a boiling pot and burning rushes, he breathes, his breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. And it talks about his undersides at the bottom there, like sharp potsherds, spreading pointed marks in the mire. On earth there is none like him, which is made without fear. He is king over all the children of pride. So again, here was a creature that was acquainted, Job was acquainted with. God wouldn't talk to him. He, explains to Job, well, you know about this creature and you know how frightening it is. Well, I made that creature. He is the king of the sea creatures, contemporary with man, can't be harpooned, got terrible teeth, strong scales, pointed footprints, smoke and fire out of his nostrils, king of the animals and fearless. So my margin says crocodile. Well, crocodiles, being cold-blooded, do grow, and they've found remains of a crocodile, 12 metres long, 7-8 tonnes in weight, they estimate. But I've never seen a crocodile breathe fire. But how about a can't even pronounce it, Parasaurolophus. This is a creature which has got a very strange horn. Horns are usually used for fighting. But this horn points backwards, no use for fighting at all, and a very strange construction. It is thought it may be a creature that could project fire. You see, the horn is connected to the nostril. There's a passageway that goes from the nostril, up the horn, back down again, meets a middle passageway. And it's thought that by having two different chemicals in sacs, which the creature could mix together, it could then project fire down through its nostrils. And if you think, the meeting point there. If you think that breathing fire is far-fetched, well, meet this chap who's still alive and wandering around on the earth, much different scale, a very small bombardier beetle. But he has the ability to mix two chemicals together and fire at 100 degrees centigrade to disturb any predators that attack him. And he's got two different chemicals, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, which are kept separate, but when he's attacked, then they are secreted into one mixing chamber, and with powerful muscles, this is ejected as fire at 100 degrees centigrade. So, and can fire up to 20 shots in quick succession. So perhaps that was what this creature was, which has now died out. So why did the dinosaurs die out? Well, evolution has funny ideas that, well, they were all extinguished in a terrible meteorite crash. Why every life wasn't blown out of existence, it doesn't explain. Others say, well, perhaps there was a rise in temperature, or perhaps a fall in temperature, and that wiped them out. Others have said perhaps they got constipation and they dried out. Others have said, well, they got obese and they died out. And more recently is, there's a little parasite which attacks modern birds. Perhaps they were attacked by these parasites. Well, evolutionists believe that they were all gone by the time man came on the scene. And yet, there are clearly, I know they will dispute, well, these were carved by people, but the people that discovered these bear testimony that they unearthed the soil, they found these footprints of dinosaurs alongside human footprints. They lived at the same time. And we have accounts. Beowulf lived 492 AD, went to Norway. We have ancient poems, epic poems, which describe the battles that Beowulf did to slay the dragons, the Grendels, and all sorts of creatures, land creatures and sea creatures. He found means and ways of getting rid of them, which are recorded in these poems. And interestingly, this Grendel creature was bipedal, very much like the depiction on the church at Brendan on the Hill. Two small forelimbs, enormously strong jaws, skin impervious to sword blows, very ugly creature, solitary night hunter, and he found he could slay them by tearing off a forelimb. Now that's fascinating, because there exists a seal from Babylonian times which shows exactly that, a bipedal creature having its arm torn off in order to slay it. So perhaps these creatures here were the kind of things, much bigger and grown up, that he was battling with. So, yes, explorers, Alexander the Great, BC 456, he describes how his army encountered a dragon. Marco Polo, 1254 AD onwards, he recorded dealings with dragons. Philostratus, AD 172 to 250, the whole of India is girt with dragons of enormous size. Not only the marshes are full of them, but the mountains as well. There's not a single ridge without one. Those marsh ones are sluggish in their habits and 30 cubits long. and have no crest standing up on their head. So he bears witness to these things. And Pliny the Elder, time of the Lord Jesus, references large dragons in India in his natural history. And we also have accounts in this country. Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1130 recorded the history of the kings of Britain, and he recounts that in 336 BC that the Welsh king Morad was eaten by a monster. And there have been accounts right up to comparative recent times. So in 1867, there was this monster frightening people in Frittleworth in Sussex. That's only 13 years older than my grandfather, who was born in 1880. So it would seem that these creatures have only recently died out. And man has hunted them to extinction, just as he's hunted the wolves and big cats. So let's just fit it within biblical framework. I believe that God made them contemporary with man. He designed them to be his lawnmowers, to eat down the very abundant vegetation that was being on the earth in the pre-flood time. There was a need for these big creatures to eat the vegetation. Taken onto the ark, and then in the post-flood conditions, slowly demised. Shorter lives, so they wouldn't grow so big. Cold-blooded animals, as we said, grow until they die. And so, we've looked at that. So, changed atmosphere made it difficult for these huge creatures, harder for the blood to get to the brains, much less food for them, less oxygen, less energy, and so they would demise, slowly died out. Have they totally disappeared? Probably not. Many of today's lizards were probably yesterday's dinosaurs, so these Komodo dragons, as I say, if they were allowed to live for hundreds of years, would get to immense lengths. And when I was in New Zealand, I was taken to a museum, a natural history museum, and they got these little creatures which are very much prehistoric looking. There's named peaks on the back. And they allegedly flourished 200 million years ago, but there they are, they're alive in the museum and looking very dinosaur-like. So probably, when we read of dragons in history, they are the dinosaurs, and they existed because God brought them into being, he had a use for them, that use finished, they slowly died out. So interesting, fascinating objects of our study, the dinosaurs. Thank you.